This video is going to be about handling track. I've been handling track for 30 years and have come up with a method that works well for me. Now these days there are a lot of templates and tools you can use to make the job a lot easier, but I'm going to try to keep it simple here and really old school and go back to a method I learned way back when I started. The method will just use wood ties, rails, solder, and just the NMR gauges you see here. So let's get started right away. This is an HO scale NMRA gauge, and this is actually the one I'm going to be using, which is an ON3. Now, before you stop the video and say, oh, he's going to be making an ON3 turnout, the scale and the gauge doesn't matter because the mechanics are the same. And there's really not much difference in ON3 and HO. And if you model in ON30, HO and ON30 is really the same thing. Just the ties are different sizes. So to get started, you're going to have to get some ties down. And the ties can be a little bit more tricky than you think because the ties will be glued to your road bed. And if the ties are in the wrong place, when you start laying rail on there, it's going to be really difficult to change it. And so the first thing we have to do is some center lines down on your road bed. Now I'm using Homosote here, but I have hand laid track on cork with good results. And I've heard some people hand lay track on some Luan plywood. I believe Luan is the correct word. But I'm going to use the old school method of Homosote. It's easily available where I live. Someplace I guess it's getting hard to get. But I think you can order it. Homosote is a great spiking surface, although there are irregularities in the surface that we'll have to deal with. So you can see here, this is an ON3 tie and this is an HO tie. The length isn't much different, but the geometry of the height of the tie is quite a bit different. But again, it's the gauge of the rail that's important, not the size of the tie. So to get the rails down, I'm going to start by just putting some lines on the road bed here. And one of the things you might want to do is you can go to a company like Fast Tracks and they make some printable templates, and you can print a few of these off in your scale. This happens to be a number 6 ON3 template. And even though you may be wanting to make one that doesn't quite fit this geometry, if you're laying out a area, it might be nice to have a few of these to just play around with on the paper, just to kind of get an idea what's going to fit. And then you can start laying down some lines and then working outside of these, out of the geometry of this a little bit. Keep in mind that we're going to be dealing with frog angles, and the frog angle would be the angle from the through track. Pardon my terminology here, I'm not exactly going to be using the right stuff here. And then here's your diverging line here. So your frog angle is the angle measured in units between these two lines. And so this is a number 6. So for 6 inches of length on this rail, it moves away 1 inch here. And that isn't quite as important as the radius going from here down to the points. If you're going to be picking a minimum radius, my minimum radius happens to be 30 inch. You'll want to be careful that you don't use, for example, a number 4 turnout if your minimum radius is 30 inch, because the radius through the turnout will not be 30 inch. It'll be quite a bit sharper. So we're going to start by just throwing a line down, and there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can just draw lines with straight edges, which works well. So here I can just throw a straight edge in here, and you could just draw where you want to go. So we could draw a line, and if we say our points want to be right here, well then all we have to do to make, for example, I'm going to do about a number 5 turnout, is at 5 inches. We just have to go up 1 inch, and there's our number 5 turnout. Now this point here is not the points of the turnout. The points of the turnout will be somewhere past here where the radius comes in. I'll move this camera down a little bit here. And so we'll be curving through that area. And what I'd do is I'd make a little radius template, hold it up on there, and that'll give you your points location. Another method you can do, which can work pretty well here, and I've got some old HO flex track, and I know I said I'm working in ON30, but you have to humor me for a moment here, is you can use a couple pieces of flex track and kind of curve this one through here. And you can use a method like this to maybe figure out where your turnouts are going to be. And you can see where the rails come together here. That could be where your points are, and then your frog is back here. Now, if you've drawn some center lines like this, you can lay them on here and just make sure you're following. Let me make this a little bit longer here. Your center lines. Straighten this out a little bit on this end. And there would be your number 5 turnout. Now the nice thing about using the flex track is then you can quickly just draw lines on the outside of this. And then I'm going to mark where the points are going to be, which is, if I line those up, points, and then put an F here for frog, just an estimate of where the frog might be. Not that we're not going to worry about exactly where that is. So that makes a good starting point for placing your ties, because you'll know that your ties are pretty much centered where you wanted the rails to go. Now you could use a jig to make tie strips, which I would recommend in HO because the ties are quite small, and placing them in the glue without getting glue on the ties is kind of hard. But you can see how we can run down there, and when we get into the turnout area, of course, we're going to use turnout ties until we reach the limit of the turnout ties, and then we switch back to regular ties. But if you model in ON3 or ON30, your ties are longer, but you can still use the HO flex track to roughly get the center of your ties, because you can see where the limits are and still stay within those areas. Now when I do ON3 track, normally it's not this difficult because there's not a camera in the way, but when I do ON3 track, I don't use a tie strip. I just put some glue down because I don't mind the irregularities a little bit, but I would just have glue spread on there, and I'd be laying out those ties, and then when we get to the turnouts, of course, we go bigger. Now a lot of times when I'm doing a turnout tie, I will leave the point rails off because there'll be a long turnout there for the ground throw. But I'll leave those off for now, and I'll start, I may place a couple on here just as a reference, and I'll start back here and start laying turnout ties. And generally what you want to do when you lay the turnout ties is you want the turnout ties to be with the following the through route. So let me grab a few more here. So if we put a few more on here, I would be placing the turnout ties like this, keeping them perpendicular to the center line. Of course this is ON3, so I got to go a little bit past that. And I'd keep going until I hit the limits down here where the turnout, where the track space becomes so wide that the turnout tie now hits the limit, and then I would switch back to regular ties, keeping them perpendicular to that center line. Of course, there'd be glue on here as I'm laying these on here. Now you can lay them full length and cut them off after you've laid the turnout, or you can use these lines to estimate and cut them off beforehand. Now there's a lot of different ways you can do the ties too. You can pre-stain the ties, or you can do as I do, as I lay them in this state and then I stain them on the layout. And the reason why I do that is it just seems to save a little bit of time and mess. But either way, what's going to happen when you stain the ties is we're going to come back when they're glued down and we're going to sand the tops of them off till they're all back to natural wood. And what'll happen is we'll see that you can see where the low spots from the homosote and the irregularities of the ties will all level out. And that's really important that the tops of your ties are flat, because especially through the turnout, because it can cause binding in the points if the turnout ties are not level with the tops of each other. Here we are at the layout, and I'm going to start laying some ties probably over on this side of the layout here, and go all the way down through this area. Now in here I've used spline road beds, so obviously the ties are going to have to be within the spline. But the spline has wide spots in here, so I have to still figure out, where exactly the frogs and the points are going to be. And when I say actually, what I'm really looking for is to figure out where the points are going to be. The frogs will kind of vary one way or another, especially if I'm using the HO scale flex track in ON3. And even if you're using the HO flex track in HO scale, you really be trying to define where the points are going to be, and then you just estimate where the frog is going to be, so that you can know that if your next turnout is going to get too close to that, you can make some more accurate measurements so that the points don't overlap the frog. But still, marking the frog is just kind of a guess until you start laying rails. So I'm going to go get some flex track, and we're going to lay it on here and get an idea where it's going to be. And I've got some turnout ties here. I like to just lay them out on a piece of cardboard here or something next to me to make it easier to grab them with sticky fingers once I start gluing. This is ON3, so I'm using some of these Mount Albert ties I get from Fast Tracks. These are the turnout ties. And then I've got these regular ties. These are actually 7-foot ties I'm using for ON3, but I run them through, I have a Northwest Shortline chopper that I'll set to be a 6-inch cutoff, and then I'll grab several batches of them and run them through and clip off anywhere from 3 to 6 inches, so I have varying lengths of 6-foot 6 to 7-foot ties, just to give it a little bit more rustic look in here. Now I will be gluing these down one at a time on here. However, if I was in a smaller scale, like I said with HO, I would probably get a fixture to make tie strips, which is where you put them in a jig and then you run a piece of tape in there and then you lift them off into strips and lay them on here. When I was in HO scale, I made my own jig or fixture, whatever you want to call it, and it works out a lot better in the smaller scales because you don't get so much glue on them. It helps them too if you're trying to make your track look not so exaggerated in the placement of the ties. But I'll do my best to get them straight, and just the natural process will make them be enough exaggerated. I don't purposely go and make them all crooked and strange. They get that way enough on their own by placing them one at a time. Okay, to get the turnout in here, I'm going to use some of this flex track. Now I actually had a couple pieces of ON3 flex track from Precision Scale from when I had some hidden track on my old layout. So I'm going to use this because it'll get me a little closer, but I wouldn't have a problem using the HO scale flex track because I'm just really trying to make sure there's a flow here, and it's easier for me to see it if I'm looking down the rails here. And I just want to make sure it looks kind of like what I planned. And if you're wondering why I wouldn't just use flex track, well, I prefer hand laid track when I can do it. Plus the turnouts all in here are just some custom size. I know they're above a number 5. I don't know exactly. I used the Fast Tracks templates in here to make sure I was keeping as honest as I could with my angles and not make something that wouldn't work out. But again, I'm just kind of getting a rough idea to make sure the turnouts here don't overlap. Okay, so obviously this one's not going to overlap any of them, so this will be a pretty easy one to do, and it looks like my points are going to be right here. On this one, that's where I'll drill my hole, and then the frog is roughly going to be right around here. I'll just write it on the side there. Okay. Oh, sorry, that was off camera. I moved the camera back a little bit. You can see this is where I marked the points and the frog. And then I guess on this next one here, I had just one more piece of this flex track. I'm going to make sure that this one comes out here. Now, when I did my spline, I actually had this turnout coming in a little too tight here, so I added 2 more pieces of spline out here to push this turnout down a little bit. And I think that's going to look pretty good. So I'm kind of coming diagonal across these splines here. That's a little sharp down there. And that probably looks pretty good. I'll look down it this way. I'm pretty happy with that, and I'm going to leave that there just for a second because I know this one's going to work out. I'm just going to make sure that I'm not in my frog area here. This one can be a little straighter here. And so you can see my frog down here, so my points are going to be right. Well, so here's the problem. There's a brace right here, so I'm going to make sure my points are back here. Oops. Turned off my light. So I'm going to bring this back just a little bit. So that's where my point is, and my frog will be way back about here. And then, so you can see, this is that area where it gets really close right here. And, but I can probably get the points in right here. And then my frog should roughly end up being right about here. Okay, now I'm gonna, since this is an open area here, I didn't need to draw the sides of the ties on this section because I know they're going to be right in this, but this one is a little wider. So I'm going to make sure I'm in here. Now a pencil would work good for this, but I'm using a Sharpie so you can see it better on that camera there. The white stuff you're seeing in here is caulking that I spread in some of the larger gaps of the splines so that the roadbed material, or the ballasting material, which will pretty much be dirt in here, wouldn't just sift endlessly down through those holes as I'm trying to glue it in there. Okay, now this one, I want to kind of make sure this is looking reasonable here for my flow. The reason why I'm doing this is because there's a lot of times where especially in the past, and I've seen it happen to many other people, is you'll lay your ties, you get them glued down, and when the rail comes through, it's not centered, and you'll end up having the one rail be really close to the edge of the tie while the other one is really far away. And like I said, it's hard to change that when the glue is down, or when the ties are all glued down, because you're going to end up having to scrape them out of there. But still, if that were to happen, it's exactly what you'd want to do, is just take them out of there. You don't want to leave them looking like that. That wouldn't be right on the prototype, to have the ties all on one side of or the rail all the way to one side of the ties. now I can pretty much eyeball the rest of that down there, but I think I've got it all marked here pretty good. So we'll get rid of these. This is the glue I'm going to use to glue my ties down. It's just a wood glue. I'm sorry about the lighting in here. I haven't got all the lights installed up in here yet, but I use the wood glue rather than the white glue, so that when I'm doing scenery, the white glue doesn't soften. But I've seen people use both. I'm going to use it straight out of the bottle. I've seen people before thin it a little bit and then use a brush to get it on here. It's a little bit maybe neater way to do it, but I'm just going to go ahead and use it this way. I've always used it this way. I've got a little piece of scrap Homosote here that I'm using for a spreader because it's going to get all over the place and on your fingers. And again, what will happen is you'll get that on the ties, and then those areas won't hold stain. Even though we are going to be sanding at the top, you still have the sides that you'll have to worry about, and you'll see that white wood. That would be one of the benefits of pre-staining your ties, but I find that if I'm just careful, I can avoid that pre-staining process and make it work out. Okay, so I'm just going to start by laying a little bit of glue down. Now, I don't like to work in a long area, so I wouldn't spread glue on this entire section of roadbed. I'm only going to work in about a section, this long, because I don't want the glue to skim over. And I'm going to start at this turnout here, and I'm not going to put these head block ties in yet. So I'm going to just kind of lay one on there. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and just put some glue down, and then I'll lay that on there and then move it over. So I'm going to come through here. Now, some people say that you'll want to keep your glue out of your spiking area because it can make the spike hard to push through the glue. And I noticed that it's going through the glue, but I don't really go out of my way again to make sure it's out of the spiking area. I find it goes through just fine. But you don't need a ton of glue on here, so you just gotta lay it through. But I do like it a thin layer though, so maybe that's why I don't have a problem with it. I make sure it's nice and thin. But this also is the reason why I don't go very far with the glue, because it will skin over significantly faster the thinner it is. So I'm just going to stick this one in here just to know where I'm starting at. And then I'm going to go, now again, you will want to make your edge of your ties follow your main line here. So this one, although this one's a Y technically, so I guess I'm going to make it just go right down the middle here, but I'm going to go ahead and stick it on. Now I'm using a little bit wider space, but technically in turnouts you want to keep your space pretty close to being a normal spacing. Even when there's areas where the ties were laid farther apart, usually at the turnout they kept them pretty tight. Helps support the turnout, the mechanics of it. Also want to make sure that we're not too. I also want to make sure that when we're doing this, we're not too skewed off of the axis of the turnout here. So I'm letting them be a little bit over this way because I can trim those when I'm done. Okay, so now I've reached my limit on both sides here, so now I'm going to switch to regular ties here. And these for sure you're going to have perpendicular. And you can even have them touch right up here sometimes if that's what it takes. Glue is getting a little dry on this end, so I'm just putting a little bit more here. Now I'm going to start spacing them farther apart, since this is narrow gauge and kind of branch line-ish. And so again, I'm trying to make sure I'm not laying them in here like this. They'll get that way on their own enough that I don't have to exaggerate them, but you don't want them all that way. So Okay, that's the limits of my glue right there. And there I've reached the limit of that. Now I'm going to start from this point and work my way back to this one here, and then same with this, and I'll work from the points here up to this one, and then I'll go and fill in all the areas with the little turnouts, or I'm sorry, with the little ties. But I do have a little bit of glue up here, and I'm going to just so I know my next head block will be right about here. And so now I'm going to start, oops, I got to smooth that out. And again, at the turnouts, I tend to have the first 3 ties relatively, normal spacing. I guess normal, by normal what I mean is like a mainline spacing, if you want to call it that. Just because it supports the rail at the points a little bit better. So now I've got my 3 here that are fairly close, and then I'll start going out to that kind of more exaggerated spacing. And it looks like I could probably get 1 more in here in the glue. I can go for 1 more. Okay, so I'll leave this area here, and now you can sight down this too. That would put me in front of the camera, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just look on the video here and see how that looks. That looks pretty good. You can see where I adjusted those ties down here that were kind of starting to skew a little bit. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to finish this. I'm going to start here, I'll work my way back here. Over here I've got another turnout, and here I've got that HO scale flex track. And this particular area here too, I've added a little more on here to change the angle of this turnout. And I'm using the HO track here just to show that it can be done here with ON3. But this looks pretty good here. There's a riser here, so I'm going to make sure that the switch machine is going to be on this side of it here. So I've kind of moved the points back just a little bit here, and mark the points right along here, and then I'll just go ahead and trace this. In this particular spot, I'm just going to trace it here at where the turnout's going to be, because I don't need to go down here, up here. I kind of know the angle, but this will be about where the turnout's going to be. And I'll get rid of these here. Now in this particular spot, I'm going to go ahead and drill the hole here for the turnout, the switch machine first. I'm just going to drill a 1/4 inch hole to start. Now for a tortoise switch machine, you only need a 1/4 inch hole, but I'm just going to enlarge this to 3/8 just to give me a little more space. There we go. Okay, I've spread out the glue here like the previous turnouts. In this particular one, I'm going to start here at the points. I'm going to lay in some full length ties here, and I'm going to go right over the top of that hole. Some of this stuff doesn't really matter too much order you do it in. A lot of times I just do, like if I don't have my drill handy, I'll just I won't lay the ties for the points here, and I'll drill the hole later. This time I happen to have it handy. Now I'm going to put a regular turnout or a regular tie here, just to make sure that I'm watching. Since I used HO flex track, I want to just make sure I'm equally spaced here to get started. So I'll put a couple here, just making sure that the overhang over the HO track is about the same on both sides. And then I'll make sure these ties here for the switch stand are about the same. Now I'm going to work my way this way on the turnout here. So my glue is drying here. So I'm just add a little bit more. And then spread it out. So with the pre-cut ties, they change about 1 foot, and this is where you probably want to look at a turnout jig or turnout template. And this is actually a nicer way to do it if you know that the turnout's going to be relatively standard. I mean, even though it has a slight curve here, it's pretty close. This will just save a little bit of work later on. Now I'm using this overhang that I'm seeing here to make sure the overhang is about the same all the way down this line. I'm not worried about this side here as long as these ties are on the outside of this line here. Okay, now that I've reached the limit of my full length ties here, I'm going to switch back to just standard ties. And now I'm going to change their angle to follow the curve of the branch here. And I'm going back to my wider spacing here. Now in some areas of the turnout you'll get a little bit of overlap in here, and that's okay. You just gotta get them in there. You just go between the other two, go between the two ties here. Now you want to look down these and kind of sight down them to make sure they're falling before they get really, before the glue really sets up here. Give them a little push in here. Alright, and I'll continue laying these out through this area following the rest of the road bed here. Okay, now it's time to stain the ties. Over the years I've used a couple different methods that both work equally as well. I've used artist acrylic paints, as you see here, which is a black and a burnt umber, and I just mix the two together to get a black brownish color. Or I've also used just some regular wood stain here. This color is called ebony, and this one was called hickory armoire. And this color here is basically a burnt umber color. And I do the same thing, I just mix the two together till I get a blackish brown color. I think both work equally as well. This has a little more odor, but this also seems to take into the wood just a little bit deeper than the artist acrylic paints here. But I think both work well, and it depends on just what you prefer to work with. Unfortunately, this section of the video of me doing the actual staining got lost. But it's really not that difficult. Just get a brush and brush it on, making sure that you get all the wood on the ends, both on the open ends of the ties and on the sides of the ties. Those are sometimes easy to forget. Okay, here we go. This is the ties that were stained with the oil-based stain. They've been drying for a couple days and they're good enough to sand now. You can see how this mixture kind of turned out here. Some good variety in the colors here. Now let's go over and take a look at the acrylic ties. And here we have the ties that were stained with the acrylic washes. Pretty much look the same. I probably had a little more brown in these. When I go to stain the tops after sanding them, I'm going to make them a little more black. But they dried up real nice. Really no difference in them. They actually dry a lot faster than the oil-based ones. So now we're going to move on to sanding the ties. So let me get set up here and we'll get started on that. So for sanding the ties, what I have here is just a 1x2 block of wood that I've glued some sandpaper onto. Now the ties I'm using here are made from pine and they're a little harder to sand. So I'm using 80 grit here to start. And if I was using a basswood tie, or if I was in a smaller scale, I'd probably use more like a 120 to a 220 grit. Kind of just depends on how rough or how uneven you think your ties are. And you'd know it pretty quick. You could start out with 220, and if it seems like you're sanding a lot, you could go switch to 120. But I've already done some sanding here, and I know that I really want to start here with 80 grit. And one of the things I've done with this block of wood is, you can see here, I've just rounded up the ends of the block just a little bit here on both ends. So it kind of has a little bit of a ramp. That way when I'm sanding against the ties this way, I'm not tearing out ties by hitting them on that edge, especially if they're sticking up a little higher. And generally I don't sand exactly like this. I kind of sand a little bit diagonally until I start to get them level. So I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of start sanding these, and you can see right away the ones that are higher, they just pop out right away, and then this one barely even got hit at all. So it doesn't take long to see why we have to do this. So again, now you can see some more showing up here. Here's some low ones in here. You got to be careful when you do it, if you get this happening, to make sure that, you know, that could be high, but I might be also leaning the block. So I'm using a pretty light pressure here on this thing, because the 80 grit makes it so I don't have to really put a lot of elbow grease into it. So now you can see here, these are already becoming level. So you can even leave just a little bit. So I'd be done sanding here right now. And I'm just going to go till these even up here. And don't just go in a little spot, because you'll make a dip there. You want to go in long strokes. Now here, I'm just starting to touch the color here, but I'm going to keep going because I know for a fact that the rail will be over in this area. Now, if I was still seeing color in the very middle, but it was light on these, I would stop at that point. I wouldn't go any farther, but this one's low here. Now, if you can't sand out a low spot, rather than bringing all of the ties down, what I do is I will take and I will glue another tie on top of that low tie. And I usually use ACC to keep it, or to make it go faster. And then I carefully sand that tie down. Now, if it's just barely too low, you could take a piece of basswood and some really thin basswood and lay it on top, as long as it's the same width. But that's how you fix a low tie. You don't bring them all down if you have a really, really low tie. When you're using Homosode, it's actually really common when you're laying the sheet flat to have very low dips in there. I've seen them go as low as half of a tie thickness in HO scale. And I've had to glue long sections of ties, double ties high. But having this Homosode up on edge, I've already sanded the Homosode roughly level, and so now I'm just getting rid of some of the irregularities caused by the tie's thickness varying, or the fact that when it was in the glue, it didn't dry all the way down. So here's a section of ties that I purposely left unstained to show you something that you can do if you don't want to stain your ties twice. One of the things you can do is, with the same sanding block, you can sand your ties and then what you want to do is get in real close, and you can look at the ties, and you can tell by the ones that are sanding the tops off, because they'll have sawdust stuck on one edge. If we come down here, we can see that some of them, like right here, now these are sanding very well. They've got a lot of sawdust stuck onto them, but now that one right there has barely any. And if we keep sanding those down, you can kind of see how the wood looks a little bit raw on top, so you don't necessarily have to stain them. However, staining them is a really quick indicator of, you know, how low you need to go. So eventually you're going to get to a spot where you're going to be sanding and knock out a few ties. And you don't have to be finished for the evening just to glue those back in. What you can do is just sand off the glue, making sure I keep the glue side down. Make sure there's no dust in there. And then what I usually like to use is some of this thick super glue here, so I can get that to focus. Put a healthy bead on the bottom. It's a little too much. Put some on the other one here. And put them back in place. And go ahead and get some accelerator. Give them a good dose there, and then you should be able to keep sanding. So the way I like to build turnouts is I like to start by placing the stock rails first. And the first step I'm going to have to do here is file away the base of the rail for the points to sit up against. And I like to start my notch on the side of the stock rails about 30 thousandths ahead of the head block tie. So if this is where the points are going to be, this is the tie just ahead of the points. I'm going to move another 30 thousandths ahead of the edge of that tie and file in my notch and come back about an inch and a half, somewhere in there. And you can use these fixtures or these jigs here from Fast Tracks, but I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way where I file it on the side with just a plain file. And for a file, I just like to use a single cut file. And I like to get a nice good one here that's nice and sharp. It saves a lot of trouble. Don't use little mini files. You'll just be working too hard at it. So to mark that notch, I'm going to use a permanent marker here. And I'm just going to go on the top of the head of the rail. And I'm just estimating about 30 thousandths ahead. And I'm just going to draw a line back. And then I'm going to put a dot on the back side so I know that that's the back of the rail, so I'm not accidentally filing forward. I'll do that on both rails. Now, just to make sure I remember where this is, I'm going to turn this on its side, and I'm going to copy that same pattern so I know which is the inside versus the outside. There. Now I'm going to go over to the side of the layout here, and I'll show you how I file those. So if you don't use a jig to file your stock rails, what you can do is you can find an edge of your layout. In this case, I have the plywood edge here, or I've used a 1x4 or a 1x2 part of the framing, and you can lay the rail up so that the base of the stock rail is tight to the side of the piece of wood here. And now it's easier on this one here because I'm filing with my hand holding it down on this side and filing this way. It's a little bit trickier if you're right-handed and you got to file this way because you have to hold it over on, cross over. Another way you could do it is you could probably clamp these down with some clamps if you had to. But I'm just going to hold this here and start my file. And the way I'm going to do this is, of course, the file only cuts on the push stroke. So I'm going to push down, and as I push the file across the metal here, I'm going to kind of go at a diagonal and then lighten my pressure as I go this way. Now we only have to go 1.5 inches roughly, so if you look, I'm going to file from about here to about here. Actually, it's more like 1.25 inches. Go a little bit more maybe. And then, so it's going to be a taper right here. The other thing you want to do is, by doing it across a surface here with a long file, We don't want to do it flat. We want to be angled so that we're not cutting into the side of the head of the rail. We want to leave the side of the head of the rail clear of the notch. We don't want any notching in the side of the head. We're only going to be taking off the base of the rail. And actually we're going to be cutting into the base and the side a little bit by making it diagonal. So I'll just start here, being very careful on your first stroke to make sure that you don't go past where you want the notch to be. Once you get this notch kind of started, you can go a little bit more aggressive on it. See, I'm kind of filing at a really steep angle here. I'm really trying to stay out of the side of that, the head of the rail there. Now I'm looking at my permanent marker here, and I have to go just a little bit more to the left here. Okay, once you get the base of the rail filed off, I like to flip this over so the head is down, and then I just rub the file on here to just clean off any burrs along the bottom. You can go ahead here too, you can see there's a little bit of material left here. Same thing, you can put it back on here, and then you can rub the file side to side, and it makes a finer cut. There you can see that piece is lifting off of there. Okay, so that's how we file a stock rail. With the stock rails now filed on the base, the next thing I'm going to do is going to form this diverging route rail. And I don't use anything fancy, I just run my finger on it a little bit here. And you have to be careful that you don't have a burr on these because they can be a little sharp sometimes, but it's going to be a little weaker here where the points have been, or where the stock rail's base has been filed. So I'm going to give a little bit more pressure here where the rail is full. And I just want a little bit of a curve, just an estimated curve here. That's a little too much. But I like my rails to sit in place and not be forced over in place by the spike. So that looks pretty good right there. Now, they don't have to be perfect at this moment. We're just getting these roughly bent to the right shape. On a prototype turnout, the rail actually has a bend right here at the points. It's not a smooth curve off of there, so I'm just using this flat jawed pliers here, and I'm going to place it here at the beginning of the notch there, and I'm just kind of grabbing the head of the rail here, and I'm just giving it a slight little bend here. Now that's exaggerated, so you can see what I'm talking about there, so I'm going to bend it back a little bit. So that looks pretty good. So it goes down and it makes a bend off of the side of the stock rail. And that's important because the reason why I have my notch starting ahead of my head block tie is because I like my points to sit on top of both head block ties, or the ties that straddle the points. And now this will represent one of the points, but the points will sit right here. And what happens with that bend being just slightly ahead of that point tie there, or the head block tie,
is that when this gets filed in half and it sits against the side of that, this surface of the head of the rail and this surface of the head of the point rail will all be in the same plane. So this is our straight route. Now the diverging route, what happens is when that sits over there, it actually makes a bump. But the space between here, the inside of this, where we filed the notch in the base, if you measured with your gauge from this side of the head of the rail to this side of the point of the rail, it'll still be engaged. That's why we need to have that bend start just a little bit before the points. If you start that curve back here, like I did when I first started, I would just make a curve through here. You'll have a tight gauge problem here at your points. And then that's where a lot of issues happen with points not working out well. Now, if your diverging route was going to be the curved route and if your normal route was going to be the curved route and your straight route was the diverging route, then you need to actually make a little bit of a kind of an offset bend, like what they would call a dog leg bend in the side of the stock rail. And if you start looking at that on prototype turnouts, you'll notice that if you look down from the front of them, that they actually have a little notch. And what that does is it allows the point to be in that little notch or that little bend in them. It's not a notch, it's a bend, because that protects the tip of the point for the straight route, which is the at track speed route. There's always a speed reduction through the diverging route because of that problem with the point being exposed. But my diverging route here is the curve, so I've got my notch on that side to protect the point on the straight route, which would be track speed. So at this point, what I like to do is I'm going to spike these down in their final place. I'm going to do a spike every fourth tie. And the reason why I like to do that is because these define the shape of the turnout. I can sight down these and make sure they're following my route. And then we'll come back and we'll build the frog off of these two rails here. So I'm going to go ahead and spike these down. To spike down the stock rails, I've started here at the beginning and I've centered the rails on the ties, and I've spiked 3 ties out on all the sides here, and these are still loose here. What you'll want to do is you can sight down this rail and make sure it's straight, but what really is important is that when it comes off at the ends of the turnout here, that the rails are going to be centered between or on the ties. And when I mean centered, what I mean is that when you have 2 rails on here, let's see if I might move this back here so you can see back here. So what I mean by centered is that when you have 2 rails, you want to make sure that when they are spiked in gauge, that they are also roughly centered on the ties. Now, being this is narrow gauge, I've taken a lot of liberties with my tie placement. They're not perfectly straight anywhere on here, either this way or this way. So I would use an average center. In a couple ways I've done it is the cheap and easy ways. I've made just these plastic kind of templates here that have 2 rail notches and then a tie notch, and you can kind of put those on a tie and get a good idea of where the rail is going to be need to be centered. Because if you start spiking the rail and it's too far over this way or this way, what you get is this condition where the rails look something like this, and you've got very little tie on one side and a lot on the other, and that's hard to fix because it usually starts somewhere way back along the rail here. So what you'll want to do is get that centered the best you can. Another thing I've done is I've got a few of these rolling gauges here, and I've actually put some layout dye on here and scribed a line
that is centered. And you can put these, if you take your rail you're going to spike, and then a little scrap piece of rail, you can place these on here, and then you can actually just slide this side to side and get a rough idea where you want to be. So now that I've actually got this landed right about where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and just throw a couple spikes right here, and then maybe a little bit farther down the line to make sure that the curve comes off of here right. So I'm going to go ahead and spike this quick. Little trick when you're spiking is if you have like a piece of wood or something laying around here, a lot of times I'll take a pinch of spikes and I'll drop them on so they spread out, in a kind of a random pile here. And then my spiking plier is magnetized, so I can just tap one and pick it up and then grab it with my pliers here. And just in case you're wondering, the band-aids are not from spiking rail. Okay, I'm just going to check that again real quick here to make sure that it didn't move it out of the way. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay. Now we're going to do the same for the other route here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a piece of rail on here. Once you get a few spikes in, it's not so awkward doing all this stuff here. Okay, now we've got the rails kind of secured on this end. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get one rail fixed, which is my straighter of the two here. And then I'm going to go and sight down and make sure the curve through here is how I want it. So I've gone ahead and spiked every fourth tie through here on both sides of the rail. But when we get down where we've taken the base of the rail off, we're only going to be able to put the spikes on the outside. And for now we're just going to put a couple in there, but I will normally do every single tie through here. But I'm going to wait till I get the points finished to do all of them, but I want to do a couple so we're not pushing this rail back and forth when we're trying to set the point width. And when I put these in here, I don't go tight to the base of the rail, and I also don't drive them all the way down really hard, because what will happen is if you go too close to the base of the rail or push down too tight, you'll actually push the rail over. So I'm just going to go one right here in the throw bar. So I just pushed it down until it made contact, and then I stopped. And if you think that maybe you've spiked too close because you've seen that the head of the spike was going to come in contact and push it over, just pull it out and either grab a spike with a smaller head, because the heads kind of vary, or just file it off. I wouldn't put it in a different hole because you'll end up opening the hole really big and it'll get loose. So I'm just going to put one more in here. See, that rail moved just a little bit, so I'm just going to straighten it back out. And then, of course, make sure you sight down all the time to make sure you're all in line. So with this rail all spiked down, and this rail's still loose here, except for our point down there, I'm going to take another piece of rail, and I'm going to lay it in here so that it is just about where, a little bit, I'm going to give it about the space between two ties ahead of the points. So that probably sounds confusing, but our points are going to be here. Our notch is filed up here. So I'm just going to go in the space right in front of them and start this rail. Just put the end of this rail here. And then I'm going to kind of go through back to where we come down on this end, maybe a few inches past where the regular ties start. So we're through the turnout. See if you can see that somewhere down in here where we switched back to regular track ties here, and I'm just going to clip that off. And I'm going to flip it around so I've got the other clean end here. And I'm going to do the same here. These don't have to be exact or perfect because these are going to be cut up for other pieces too. So I'll set one of those aside. Now what I'm going to do is, again, starting up here, just place that rail in there. I'm actually going to go ahead and spike this rail down. And this will make more sense when you see where I'm going with this. So I'm using it. So rather than using a this kind of gauge in here in a turnout, I always use an NMRA gauge in the turnout, and I keep the gauge between the rails fairly accurate. And when I'm spiking these down, I'm going in the same tie. I've put the spikes in here, so I'll spike in that same tie all the way across the turnout. Now this one I spiked just slightly tight, so I'm just going to give it a little bit of a nudge. Okay, that's good for what we're going to do now. So now you might think, you know, what's next here? Actually, throw. Okay, now that this rail is all spiked in here, I get an idea of kind of how this turnout's going to look. And I can judge where, if I slide this track gauge along here, I can get an idea where the frog point is going to be. So right there it's telling me that that's about where the frog point is going to be. And I'm just going to kind of hold that down. And I'm going to sight down my turnout and make sure that it's following the ties where I want it to be. So I think I want to move that frog point a little bit farther this way. So I'm going to move this rail out. So now it's telling me it's a little bit farther forward. And where I'm looking here is I'm watching kind of how this rail is coming off the back side of this turnout. You can see now it's more even, the spacing of the way the ties stick out. So this is probably where that rail would want to be. And then I'm looking at this curve through here, and if I continue straight off of here, this looks like a pretty good form. Now you may have this thing constantly curving, or this may be a Y, but this gives you a good idea of the shape of the turnout. And so I like the shape of this one, and I'm going to go ahead and throw a couple spikes in here to make sure this rail stays where I'm holding it. And just so in case you're wondering, some of these spikes will get pulled out, but we're going to put these in to make sure that the turnout stays the shape we want it, and we don't start spiking it and it starts moving all in different places we hadn't planned. So I like the flow of this off of here. Again, I'm going to sight down and make sure it goes the right way. Looks really good. So I'm going to start spiking out and fill the gap between where I started down here into this one here. And again, I'm going to be in the same tie all the way across. The reason why I want to be in the same tie all the way across is because it helps maintain the rail gauges, because you're not putting spikes here and then this one is engaging here, and then you get like these dips between all the different points here. You know, if you do it like this, you have the chance of the rail just kind of walking its way down. Okay, now I've got this part filled with spikes. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spike again down through this curve here, making sure that I don't push this rail side to side. And now again I'm going to put just a couple on the back side here where the base of the rail is filed off. This one's particularly important that you don't push it in, meaning push it in to narrow up the gauge here. We want to make sure that angle right from that point where we made the bend comes off of there kind of straight through here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take all the spike heads on this inside rail, we're going to turn them 90 degrees. And we're going to remove that rail. Now this rail, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start back here. Let me move this camera just a little bit. So we are going to start the rail back here. And this one I'm going to form it a little bit by running my finger on here, getting a little bit of a bend in it. And I'm just going to make sure it kind of follows the bend right here. So you can see here it kind of should be a little straighter. So I'm going to come back and bring it back a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. Is I'm going to start spiking this, and I may have to remove some of the spikes I put in here if they interfere where it crosses over. So it looks like this pair of spikes is going to have to come out, but that's okay. So we're just going to pull those out. But leave as many of those other ones in there as you can. And again, I'll show you where I'm going with all that here in a minute. So this one I can't, it's probably going to be, the frog looks like it's going to end up being right around in here. And so I'm not going to put another spike on the other side. I'm going to find another spot here. I'm going to move down, come down here. Again, you want your gauge here to be pretty much spot on. Now with this rail in here, we're going to take the track gauge and we're going to slide it up. And we've got an approximate idea that the frog is going to be somewhere in here. So I'm not worried about having a little bit of extra on this end. And so I'm just going to go ahead, just put a mark on the rail head there. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn all the spike heads 90 degrees on this rail. I'm going to pull it out. And now where that mark was, I'm going to take my flat pliers here and I'm going to form the wing rail. Now I've probably overbent it, but that's okay. We'll check it here. Oh, actually, it's not too bad. So where you know when you get it about right is when you've come up your set of spikes you just did, and now it's transferred over kind of next to the spikes that you put in earlier. So you can see I've actually had to move it ahead almost 2 ties here, but that's okay. A little bit of waste isn't too bad there. And so you'll know when you get it right. I'm going to go ahead and remove this one spike about where the frog's going to be. Is if I put it back in here and I put these spikes back in place, what you want to do now is you want to turn your NMRA gauge so you're using the flange way part of the gauge, and we're going to stick it on the stock rail. We're going to bring it down to where we made that bend, and now we can move this point where that bend is up and down here. So what we want to do is I'm going to be pushing on this rail here. We want to make contact with this side of this flange way gauge. So I pushed up there, I've just made contact. So if I slide this through here, it does not hit that point of the rail right there. So because this is going to be the wing rail, so the wheel is going to be on this side of that, and this will be on the back side. So what this point of the gauge represents is that's the flange of the wheel set, so our rail wants to be on the inside of that. I can see right here one of these spikes is going to be in the way, so we'll get rid of that one too. So you can see that right here it touches, but now the rail moves away, which means that this bend is a little too steep. So I can go ahead and correct that bend just a little bit. And now that, if I were to spike that in there, it completely follows the back side of that gauge right there. So now we know that that's in the perfect spot. So we're going to leave that for a moment. We're going to do the same with the other one here. So now with this one kind of defined here, I'm going to move on to the other one, and now I have a better idea where that bend's going to be. I don't even have to put the rail in the spikes because I already know that bend is going to be adjacent to the one we just made. So if I lay this in to my previously put in spikes, I can do the same thing. I can put it on this side and run that up. They're usually right next to each other. They should be right next to each other. Not usually, they always are right next to each other. So now I've got my closure rails right where they have to be. We can go ahead and actually clip these off. Somewhere down here, we'll trim these shorter. So now that we've got the closure rails formed, we're going to go ahead and make this frog point itself. To do that, we're going to take those two short pieces of rail that we clipped off, or some other short pieces of rail. We have to file the inside edge to a point. And this is a fairly sharp angle most of the time. It's not like filing a set of points where you have to go a long distance. And so what I like to do with that, if you don't have, well, first of all, what I like to use is a Fast Tracks point filing and frog filing jig, but I'm going to show you that it can be done without it. And again, we're back at the edge of the layout. Somewhere on there, it can be on the framework too. And you can put a little notch in there to hold the base of the rail this way. And now I'm taking the rail and I'm tipping it quite a bit down. And if you don't have the point jig, this might be a little bit of a trial and error thing. But now I'm just going to go ahead. Now this one you do want to file the back of the head of the rail. So basically you want to make this to a pretty sharp point. One thing you want to be careful is you don't want to get into the web of the rail because that'll make it weak right here. So you can see this is almost pretty much perfect right there. If you watch that, especially if you're using weathered rail or painted rail, you can kind of see how they how that should look right there. So you got to make two of those. Remember, make sure one's opposite the other side, and then we're going to go ahead and install them over on the turnout. Now at the turnout here, because we've got some of these spikes in here, we can actually slide these. So the filed side that we just did is going to come in on one of these here. So the spikes are back in place. Now this one has a little bit of a curve through here, so I'm actually going to take and slide that back out of there. Now we're going to take the opposite one. Now all we have to do is slide them together. And we're actually going to have to get rid of these inner spikes. You can see the turnout is starting to take pretty good shape here. So this is Code 83 rail, and with Code 83 rail, the bases of the rail pretty much touch. So I'm just checking to see that I didn't move my point here. And checking this one here. So right now my points are way too far forward, so I'm going to bring them back till they fall down inside of there. So we're looking at right about pretty much perfect. I'm going to bump these back just a tiny bit. So this is our frog. It's pretty well formed up here now. I'm going to check again with the flangeways. Through the frog, we're always using the flangeways. We're not using the normal gauge very much. We're making sure that there's not a tight gauge. We're also making sure we're pushing the gauge. So this, I'm pushing it this way to make sure I'm always maintaining tight contact with the stock rail. And if you have it in the wrong spot, what'll happen, for example, if this rail is too far over this way, the one on this side will be up on top. And if you have it crooked, what'll happen is you'll feel it as you slide it through, it'll tighten up. If it's too close, of course, it'll also be up on top on the inside of the frog. So it's really a balancing act of being pretty much perfect. Right there is where you want that to be. Now at this point, what I like to do when I get that where I want it to be is now, so I pulled up all the kind of the spikes in this area here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put a couple spikes just on the wing rails, just to kind of keep them in the right centered location. I'm not driving these down hard, they're just there to hold it. So this is one of the things you can see that can happen here if these rails are a little bit sprung up. And so they don't want to just lay in their natural positions. Now at this point you have to make a judgment call on how long you want your wing rails to be. And I like mine fairly short. I like to keep them 1 inch long. I just think it makes the turnout look a little bit more not so bulky. But again, that's a judgment call. Some people like them really long, but I'm going to do mine at 1 inch past this mark here. So I'll bring in and so this, and I also want them to be on some ties here. So I'm going to get rid of the part I'm coloring here with the marker. So I'll clip those off. To do that, of course, I'm going to take the rails out, clip them off, and then give a little bit of a bend on the end. So to take those out, we just turn out the spikes again. So now I'll do the other one here off camera, but I just want to show you something. If you take a set of trucks and you make sure that their gauge is perfectly in gauge, when you run it through that frog, there should be no clicks or pops whatsoever. And since I don't have a guardrail in here, I'm actually having to hold the truck closer to the stock rail. But the reason why that shouldn't click is because the wheel, as it's leaving the point of the frog, before it fully leaves it, the actual outside of the same wheel starts to ride on the wing rail. You can check them both. The truck shouldn't pull up. If it starts to lift up, it's because the wheel is actually hitting the back of the wheel is riding up on the wing rail. It should be perfectly level. You shouldn't feel it even wiggle going across there. So I'm going to go ahead, clip this one off, bend it, and then I'm going to take these rails and clean all the weathering off the inside where we're going to put some solder. So what I've done here is I've taken this pretty much all apart, and I've gone ahead and removed the weathering from the backside surfaces here where we're going to be soldering the frog together. And I've used what works pretty good is to use one of these wire wheels and a Dremel. You can see this one's well worn out. You just have to be careful because it will throw the little wires out, so make sure you're wearing safety glasses, and you'll probably end up with these in your feet for about a week. So just kind of be careful with these. If you don't want to use these, I've used these diamond files here. These actually work pretty good because you can get in all kinds of nooks and crannies. You can, run it in here. Make sure you really want to get that groove at the bottom of the flange here at the base of the rail and just scrape off all that weathering. If you don't like doing that, you can actually use non-weathered rail. It works a lot easier, but I'm trying to keep this simple and not have to have a lot of different supplies here. If you use non-weathered rail, you can always, as you can see later on, we'll take this all back out one last time, and then you can paint it all or weather it then and before you put it back in. So what we're going to do here now with this all cleaned up is I'm going to go ahead and put everything back in, and we're going to make sure all the spikes are turned back in place. Now we're going to check it one final time here. Okay, now with the rails back in and everything kind of where I originally had them, you can see the wing rails end on that tie there. I'm actually going to throw a couple more spikes in, and where these are going to go is I'm going to put one on the inside here. It's a little bit tricky. Sometimes what I do with these is I turn them parallel with the rail and go down in there, and then I turn them back just a little bit with something that I can get in there. And I'm going to try to get one more in there. I don't know if I can or not. That'll keep that was springing up. Now that's nice and tight down there. We want those to all be sitting tight down on the ties. And I'm going to put a couple spikes in right here to hold that down. Okay. Now, at this point, I believe that someone could actually just glue these down. But I'm going to go ahead and do the old-fashioned way of doing a soldered frog here. And for that, I'm going to use a 40-watt soldering iron. Okay, to solder up this frog, I'm going to take a little bit of this Tix flux. I'm just going to apply it back here along the base of the rails. Just a tiny little bit up here on the tip of the frog. Make sure you put the lid on that. Set that aside. Then I'm going to take some solder here, and I am going to cut off just a couple pieces. And now I'm just going to go ahead with this 40-watt soldering iron and heat up the rail. I'll put a little bit up here too. We'll solder that. Now this is, in case you're wondering, some rosin core solder, but it won't matter because we're going to clean that out. Seeing what I'm doing with the camera, where I want to be. So now I'm just going to get this whole thing really hot. So make sure you get a little more solder out at the tip here. So I'm going to get this thing nice and hot. So all the solder is fluid. I'm going to take a flat part of my gauge here and push down. And I'm going to hold it there until the solder solidifies. So what that does with pushing that down is it makes sure the top of these are all in the same plane. Now we're going to let that cool for a few seconds. So with the frog cooled off, the next thing I'm doing is I'm going to mark where I want to cut to put the gaps in the rail here. So I'm going to take and cut those pieces off, and I'm actually going to mark too where the tip of the point is going to be. So now I like to have my tip of my points halfway on those head block ties. And now if you were going to cut gaps in here, it'd be a good time to cut them too after we take this out of here. But I'm going to leave mine all one piece here for this particular turnout. I'm also going to do bending rail switch points. I'm not going to use hinged points on this particular one. If we were going to do hinge points, I would then mark where I'd want to cut those and just snip those ends off down here. So now we'll get this turnout out of here. We'll turn all these spikes again and lift this out for the last time. So with the inside of the switch removed, I've clipped off the ends and squared them up. Now we have to clean out the frog here, and for that I'm using a short piece of hacksaw blade. Now you could use a longer one. It's a little more comfortable to do that, but this also could be done on the layout, which is how I used to do it, but I don't like to do it that way now because it leaves too much of a mess around the turnout, and it just seems to be, I can turn this to where it's easy for me to do the sawing. On the layout, you're always doing very weird angles, and then sometimes you get into the tie. And it just so happens that the hacksaw blade is pretty much the perfect width for making flangeways for both HO and ON3 or ON30 and even Proto 48. So I'm going to come in here, and I don't know if you can see, but I'm kind of starting it down to make sure I'm inside of the flangeway here. And I'm just running it back and forth a little bit in here to clean out some of that solder that's climbed up higher than we want it to be. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of rocking in there to make sure that it's all out from the sides of the rails. So once again, we'll use our NMRA gauge, the flangeways, to make sure that we're deep enough and also wide enough. And I have to go a little bit more. So I finished cleaning out the solder in the frog, and I've checked the flangeways in here to make sure that they're all clear. The next thing to do is decide how you want to handle making your points. You could leave it like this and then file the back side of the point rails here to make points. And then the older way to do it, or the way they used to do it, would be that this would all be one piece, and then as the points moved and touched the stock rail, that was what would power this whole entire section. I don't like relying on the contact between the points and the stock rail, so what I would prefer to do if I was going to do it that way would be to solder a wire onto this and then run it to a switch machine or something, or a frog juicer or something. But these days, what's more common to do would be to make what's called the DCC friendly turnout, and that's where we would make the points be isolated from the frog, and we would make this, for example, the point on this side be powered the same as this rail here, the stock rail, and this point be powered the same as that. That avoids a shorting situation down here at the points if the back of the wheel touches the back of the point. The advantage for doing that, especially in any, well, HO, but all of them really, the HOS scale or ON30, ON3, Proto 48, is if you make it so this rail and this rail the same polarity, I guess you could say, although I don't know if that's what it really means in DCC, and this the same, so you can actually sort of cheat the NMRA gauge down here at the points and make the space between the back of the point and the stock rail closer. And the advantage of doing that, if you're using a ground throw, is that you can go down and use an N scale ground throw, which makes it look not quite so bulky, especially if you're in the O scale. It's really nice to use the N scale ground throw. If you don't, you have to follow the point gap here. If you want to make this be all one, all one unit here, you'll have to make sure that you maintain the gaps using this, which makes it bigger, and you can't use an N scale ground throw. Then you have to go ahead and use an HO ground throw. But for this turnout, I am going to cut these free of the frog, and I'm going to put a wire on the frog. And I suggest you put a wire on the frog and run it down, even if you don't plan on using it, because someday you might want to put a frog juicer or something on that. Otherwise, you'll just leave the frog dead, and the trains using, like a keep alive, will just move over the top of them pretty much no problem. And then we'll solder a wire onto each one of these. And I prefer to solder a wire on and just run it under the layout and connect it to the bus wire. Some people will run a wire across and solder it right to the stock rail that it's next to, but I like to just run it straight through. And that'll allow us to easily, by cutting these point rails free, it'll allow us to easily make the points. If you want to leave this at one unit, what I do is I clamp a piece of 1x4 or something to the layout, and I'll slide the points over the 1x4, so they're sticking like this, and then I file off the ends, and then I can flip it over and on the 1x4 and do the other side. Now I'm not going to cut these with this tool here because it'll leave too big of a gap there, and I prefer not to use a Dremel either because I don't like the gap size it leaves there either. So I'm just going to use a razor saw and just saw these right off, and I'm going to do it. I like to actually pick my spot where I cut these things, and so I'm just going to set this in place here. And I like to do it between two ties, and so I've already drilled holes right here, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the gaps. I'm going to cut them right there and there. Now if I was doing a dead frog, meaning that I'm not going to power that all, I would make the gaps closer to the frog so that that dead space is not so big. But since I am going to power my frog, even though I'm isolating it from both sides, I don't care how big this frog section is. So I'll go cut that and then clean up the ends and come back. So before I cut the point rails free of the frog, I went ahead and marked the back side where I'm going to file with the permanent marker. So I make sure I filed the correct side. and then I just sawed it off with a razor saw and cleaned the end up. So now we're going to make the point here by filing off the back side of the rail here. And unlike the notch in the stock rail, we do want to file into the web and the head of the rail. We want to actually file it in half for a distance of about an inch, inch and a quarter, and we're going to be tapering that, so it'll be, you know, just touching, starting back here and then going all the way to the middle of the rail as we get to the tip of the point here. If you've got a fast track jig, that makes that job a lot easier, but I will caution you to not put it too deep inside of the jig. You can always file it, and if you pull it out and decide it's not deep enough, you can slide it in. But if you, at this point, if you filed it too much, you'll go through the web and you'll make a really weak point, and then you have to make another one to fit in that spot. And we've already pre-bent these to fit the curve of the turnout, so it's nice to use the ones that we made already. If you don't have one, again, we can use the edge of a board or the edge of the layout and file across, so you can put the flange of the rail up against here. And again, it's easy. Some of these it's easier if you're right or left-handed. If you're right-handed and have to file the other one, then you're going to be filing, you know, crosswise this way. You could probably clamp it, which would make it easier. But I'm going to do this side here and just start off with light strokes. And this is kind of opposite. We're going to start light and go a little heavier in as we get to the point. And when we filed the notch in the stock rail, we kept a pretty steep angle on the file. But now we're going to want to keep this thing flat to this, like parallel to this surface. I would caution you, if you're freehand filing this, to start up a little bit, and then you can always dress it by going down. So I'm going to be up at about, 10 degrees here. And I do pretty light strokes, so it looks like I'm doing a lot and it's a lot of work, but I'm just doing this pretty lightly. Now once you kind of get it to take, then you can start to put a little more pressure into it. One thing that is nice about using the weathered rail is you can see the progress by the shiny silver compared to the dark color of the weathered rail. If you use a unweathered rail, you may want to actually just color the whole thing with the marker, permanent marker, so you can watch that progress. So I've just started to get into the head of the rail here, so I'm going to watch that, and as I start to see it become all silver across there, that's when I'm going to stop. So I don't know if you can see, but I'm getting really close. So where's the camera at? I'm getting really close to making the web, or getting contact with the web. You can see that the base of the rail, the file marks are starting to widen and come up really close to the head of the rail. So I'm almost to the point of stopping. Now you can see the two have connected, and then now you want to look down at the top and see how thick it is. So I can see it's still pretty thick back here, so I'm going to start to lighten up my contact, especially as I get towards the tip here, but I'm just going to work out this middle here a little bit. So now you can see that file mark is pretty long there. You can see that's a piece of silver there. I've got a good chunk of the web. If I look at the tip, it's got a slight bevel, but it's not too thin, and the head of the rail is about halfway through. So at that point, what I do is I actually take, and to make sure there's no burr on the bottom, I go and I put the file at a steep angle and I just rub that a little bit. And then I rub it across the bottom, and that just makes sure that it's nice and smooth and won't catch the tie. There's a little bit of burr back here on the web. You can just take something and just clean that off of there. It's just a little piece that'll curl off of there. Now the next thing I want to do for my points is I'm going to actually take, now this gets kind of thin here, so we want to be careful with this. The act of filing can put a little bit of a curve on it too, so you want to make sure you keep it straight there. I'm going to turn my file up on its edge here, and I'm going to just take the head of the rail and thin it just a little bit, and in just the point area here. Try not to get my hand in the way here. So I'm going to have the file just kind of riding on the flange to keep it centered on there. And in this one I am going to kind of scrub it back and forth, even though it's not the correct way to do it. It's too hard to do it where I'm at here in one stroke. So that's all I really want to take off of the head of the rail. Now I'm going to go and make another stroke. So this is the flange and this is the head. I'm going to make a stroke at kind of an angle, probably 30 degrees back. I'm going to try not to hit the flange at this point, but I'm just going to run this off a few times to kind of put a slight, almost like a knife edge on the top there, but don't make it really thin, because then your point gets weak. We just want to make a nice little kind of bevel on the back. Now the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to just put a little 45 on the tip. I'm probably only a quarter way down the height of the rail, just a small 45. And then the same thing, now I'm going to kind of come back, and we're just going to make that have a small little bevel there. So your tip should have a nice leading edge that kind of comes in at a fairly sharp, but not too thin, because we don't want to make this weak here. See if I can show that. So the last thing I do here before I'm done with this rail here is I've got some 320 sandpaper, and I'm actually just going to run that on that edge we just made to clean off any chatter marks from the file. And I also like to just rub it on the rail on the back side and then on the bottom. It just makes it, you shouldn't feel any burrs, it shouldn't cut you or catch you. Just feel nice and slippery. Check. I also clean off the entire bottom if you're using a weathered rail, so that this slides nice across the ties. I've cleaned off where the cut edge is going to be. I also like to put a little bit of a round on the end where I made the gap, just so that doesn't have a sharp edge on it either, and catch a wheel. Okay, with the points prepared, I'm going to solder a wire on the bottom of the rail, and you can see I've got a couple holes drilled here. And to do that, I'm just going to mark on the top of the rail where the hole is. And then on the layout, normally I'd draw this with a pencil, but I'll draw it here with this. I just draw a little line. And then I place the rail where that mark is, and I just roll it upside down. And I usually use something to hold the rail there. And now I know I'm going to put a little blob of solder right there. And clean off my tip here. My soldering iron's a little bit cold yet. So there's my little drop of solder there. And then I'll pre-tin the wire. So then using my spiking plier, I just bend a small 90-degree kind of foot. And while holding the wire on that line there that I just made, I've soldered the wire to the bottom of the rail. That way you don't see it on the sides. So I'll get this fish down in here into these holes, and then I'll show you how I'm going to attach the points to the frog. Before I put the points in, I'm going to go ahead and prepare a Code 83 insulated rail joiner. This is a Micro Engineering Code 83 rail joiner, and some people will leave a gap between their points and their frog. I prefer not to. I like to fill that gap up so that it doesn't close up and cause a short. And you can fill it with styrene or glue if you want to, but I just prefer to use these little rail joiners because it helps keep the rail in alignment too. But I'd like to make them smaller, so I've trimmed them from the sprue, and now I'm going to take and cut off the ends, and I usually like to go about half the distance between the part where it insulates and the end. And I just make a much smaller insulated rail joiner. So that's about what I have left. I like to have these between the ties so it's not sitting up on the tie. If you have to put it over a tie, I suggest that you notch the tie out so that the rails sit level and they don't have a bump there. So you can see how small that is on the rail. So I'll go ahead and get this installed in the layout. Okay, with the turnout all back in place and all the spikes have been turned 90 degrees, we can just go ahead and make sure they're all seated down in there. And we're still going to put more spikes in here when we're done, but we're not going to put any more in until we're happy with the way it performs. I've gone ahead and added these the rails off the end of the frog back here. These also have an insulated rail joiner. Just making sure the gaps are tight because there's no rails outside of the camera here. This all looks good here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the guardrails back here. I've got a couple spikes in the area where the guardrails are going to go. I'm just going to pull those out. And you can grab them with the spike pliers, but a little trick that I use if you have a hard time grabbing the spikes is you can use your rail cutter and you can go in there and it makes an excellent spike puller. Okay, for making the guardrails, I've got some extra rail here. And the length I like to make them is, I like the end of the guardrail to be even with the end of the frog. So that means it's going to start about here. And then you want to make sure you go through to about, just past the heel or the throat, whatever you want to call that part where it closes up there. And so I'm going to pick up this tie right there. So I'm going to be on top of those 4 ties. Now I want to make 2 of those because I like to keep them matching it to make the lengths the same. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those off and clean off the burrs. One thing I want to do is on the bottom of these is I like to sand them with some really coarse sandpaper. This is some 80 grit on a block of wood, and I like to put some really deep grooves in the bottom of that, and I'll show you why in a minute here. So to make the guardrail here, I've cut these short pieces of wire. I've got my flat pliers, and I'm just going to go back about 1/8 of an inch, maybe 3/16 of an inch, and I'm going to do just a shallow little bend on both ends, making them bend, of course, both to the same way. About the same angle. You want to be fairly neat about this. So the placement of the guardrail is kind of critical here. The purpose of the guardrail is to keep the wheel flange from hitting the tip of the frog here. And we've already gone through, when we set these, and we're using the flangeway parts of the NMRA gauge here. And as we slide that through, we're pushing against the outside stock rail. You can check to make sure you're not hitting the tip of your frog there. The other thing we're making sure is we're not hitting the throat there of the closure rails. So everything feels good there. And so what we want to do here now is when we put this guardrail in here, we're going to be basically checking the back spacing of the wheel. So we're going from the flange wave, so this face of the guardrail to the face of the wing rail here. And those should sit in those spaces here of the NMRA gauge. And that's where you'll know where the guardrail placement should be. Now, what's critical about the guardrail is that if the guardrail is too far away from the wing rail, the truck will lift up going through there because the back of the wheels, the back of the flanges will ride up on the, kind of forcing it up on top of the rails. Another case is if you don't have the space, the gauge between the face of the stock rail here and the back of the flange here, you'll also get the truck riding up. If you get the space too close here and the guardrail is maybe too far away, for example, if you had placed your guardrail in like this, then that wheel has a chance, especially going through the diverging route or the curved route, the wheel will want to go to the outside of the curve, which happens to be the point. So this is probably the one part here that really makes this turnout work smooth. So if I take my truck, and I'll just hold it here and make sure I'm not running over things. You'll notice here that it doesn't jump up at all. And you can take it, if you hold that tight there, and if you kind of push now towards the frog, you can't hit the tip of the point. Now, I'll show you what I mean by if this is too wide here. So I'm going to move the guardrail over. So now the thing, it hits that point there. And if I move it too tight, then the truck, it's hard to see it, but this outside wheel is riding up. So that spot's pretty critical. So I'm going to check my gauge here real quick again. So one of the things you can do here is you can sand off the weathering on the rails on the inside of both the stock rail and the guardrail, and you could solder that in place. But what I prefer to do is glue it in place with some ACC. And so I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit on the ties right next to the rail there, and then I'm going to slide the guardrail on top there. I find that actually is plenty strong enough to last, especially once you start ballasting and even more glue gets underneath there. It tends to hold it really well. So what I'm using here to glue the guardrail in is some CA, and this happens to be black CA from VMS. And usually you can pick this up at like military modeling sites like my Michigan Toy Soldier. And I'm just going to take a little piece of wire here, and I'm just going to put a couple little drops next to the rail there. And we'll go ahead and slide this in, and we have a little bit. Now I'm putting it next to the CA and I'm sliding it towards the stock rail. And before that grabs too hard, I'm going to get in here and check my gauge one last time. Okay, there we go. So I'll just hit that with a shot of accelerator. And now go ahead and do the same on the other side. Okay, with the guardrails in place, we're getting pretty close to being finished. And if we check this, we run a truck through here. You can see it The actual clicking is from the gaps right here, but the frog itself, no matter which way I'm pushing in both ways, doesn't even make a sound. Check both sides, same thing. So this area is set, and now we can move on to the points. The last step to finishing up this turnout is attaching the points to a throw bar. And there's a few different things you can do. One of the most common ways is to use a piece of PC board, sliding it underneath the rails here, and then soldering the points to the PC board. That will require a notch cut through the cladding here so that you don't have a short. And then you can either drill a hole in it for an under the table switch point, or put a ground throw on here if you want by drilling a hole out here. That's a real common way that throw bars are made. The downside of this throw bar is that the solder joint of the point to the throw bar will be a rigid connection, and technically when the throw bar moves the points, in reality, because the points are moving at an angle and the throw bar is going back and forth, you get a stressed joint here, and it's real common for those to weaken over time and break, and they typically will break at the most inconvenient moment there is possible. But it's still done a lot, and if you do that, I suggest that when you're all done or whatever, you have a few throw bars ready to go laying around in case you're in the middle of a operating session or having people over and the throw bar breaks. You can just pull one out quick and resolder it in place. But it's that reason that I stopped using those a few years ago, and I used a hinge point there. Now I still used on this turnout one piece point rails where I'm bending the rail, simply because this turnout's long enough that there's not a lot of stress on here. It doesn't take a lot of effort. On my shorter turnouts, I will cut the points off somewhere around here using a rail joiner to form a hinge, and that's the ultimate in durability. That point set up, if you hinge it here and you hinge it up here, will pretty much last forever, trouble free. And I suggest that you go through the trouble on turnouts that are in difficult areas to reach, or will be behind something, or hard, just anything that's going to be hard to get at in the future for making repairs, that you just go through the effort and make those turnouts be fully hinged. Also, if you have a short turnout where this length here between the points and the frog is really short, you don't, the shorter the point rails are, the more effort it takes to bend them side to side. Again, also too, if you're having to do large flangeway gaps where this is moving a lot. Now I'm going to use, since these are DCC friendly, I'm going to minimize this. I want mine to be just enough to clear the flanges and no more. So mine are probably going to move, I think it's 31 thousandths of an inch is what they say. Versus, I forget what the NMRA gauge is, but it's a lot more than 31 thousandths. It's probably more like 80 thousandths. So that's the type that's the gap I'm going to make, but I'm not going to use PC board. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a styrene throw bar, and I'm going to make little brackets, and I'll show you that. But again, if that's something you're not interested in, I would just go ahead and skip all this, but I'll show you how I make mine. Now, if you've been looking at this turnout for a while, you've probably noticed that my ties in this turnout here are low profile ties. And I tried to pick a turnout that was more typical, but this one had the best lighting and the best angle for filming. But the one condition it had I didn't want to show you was the low profile, because it required me to do something a little special here. I had to dig out the road bed a little deeper so that I can get a throw bar underneath here. But this is homosote, so I've dug this down and I've actually painted it a black color in here. And here's what I'm using for my throw bar. It's a piece of 40 thousandths black styrene with another piece of 40 thousandths black styrene glued on top. And I painted the upper one here. So this is this is 90 thousandths wide, and the lower piece is whatever the width is to go between the two stock or the two head block ties, but not be tight. In a typical turnout on my layout, there'd be a hole drilled here for a throw bar to come, or a actuating rod to come up through from a tortoise switch machine, and this wide bottom plate here would cover that hole up. And then the upper one, being only 90 thousandths wide, gives an impression of a finer, not so bulky throw bar. You can see the difference between a PC board throw bar and mine. The other condition I have here is underneath this turnout, I don't have access to it, so I'm going to run a rod out the side here, and under a hill on that side of the track here, there'll be a hidden tortoise switch machine. So I have a piece of styrene glued underneath here that I can run a rod through there, and it'll just sneak off down through the scenery underneath. I'll run it through a tube once it gets out underneath here, and then just bury all that. But this will sit underneath here just like this, and you can see it gives a nice fine impression. The black kind of takes your eyes away from the fact that there's a hole underneath there. And it also protects it a little bit from debris getting underneath there. I've been using these for the last 10 years, and I really like the throw bar like this. Had I had a hole underneath here for an actuating rod, I would just drill a little hole in the base styrene and not through the center of the throw bar. So the first step to attaching this throw bar is actually to solder on some little brass tabs that I've made. This is just 10 thousandths brass with a 24 thousandths hole drilled into it. And I'm going to solder one on each throw bar here. And I've gone through and I've cleaned off the weathering in this area here so I can solder good to them. And what I do to solder these on is I'm going to put a temporary tie underneath here, and then I'm going to run a pin down through each one of these holes to pin them in place while I'm doing the soldering. And then I'm going to pull those pins out, slide that piece of wood out, and then slide this back in place and drill down through those holes. I'm going to match drill them into this throw bar here. But the first step is going to be to get these tabs soldered on. With the tabs held in place by the pins, I'm going to add just a tiny little bit of Tix flux, being careful to keep it just on the inside of the point rails, because I don't want to solder the points to the stock rails. Some small solder and cut off two little short sections. Place them up on top of those tabs, right up against the stock rail. I'm sorry, right up against the point rail, not the stock rail. Okay, I'm going to come in here with my soldering iron that's been heating up, and we're just going to touch that on there. Making sure we let this point rail get really hot so that solder flows. Okay, now we will let those cool. So with the tabs soldered in and the pieces of wood and pins removed, you can go in here, and if you see any solder that doesn't look too good, you can clean it out of there. And then get both sides looking pretty good. This side looks pretty good here. I'm just going to give it a quick, I've just got an old brush here, and I'm just going to put some, just rub it down with some IPA on here to clean off the areas where we soldered. And then I'm going to let that evaporate off of there, and then I'll brush paint these, and then we'll attach that throw bar. It's time to finish up this turnout here. The last step is to attach the throw bar. And before we do that, I like to check my points here. And if you look at this one here, it's kind of resting in a neutral position where this one is tight up against the rail. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that when I move these that I don't feel that they're really strongly trying to spring out to one side or the other. It doesn't really matter as much if you're using a ground throw, because the ground throw can force it from side to side. But if you're using a switch machine that uses a sprung wire, sometimes the turnouts will favor one side or the other depending on which way these are sprung to. So you might find that your turnout throw is really good one way, and then the other way it doesn't quite go all the way, but yet when you take the switch machine out, the wire snaps way over. And that's because they're trying to fight this strong spring of the strong spring of the point rail. So what I like to do is make sure these are free here. And if this one is a little tight, I just come in here and gently kind of work it over, making sure we don't bend the point out in a curve. You know, if you do, you have to kind of come back, but we're just trying to get it to rest in a more neutral position, something like that. Now we know that they have about equal pressure from side to side. So then I'm going to take the throw bar and slide it in here, and I'm going to want it tight to the bottom of the rail. So I have these little pieces of basswood here that are cut to a taper on one end, and I'm just going to use those as wedges to go underneath the throw bar to make it tight to the bottom of the rail. And I'm going to put one on each side. With the throw bar being wedged up on the bottom of the rail, I'm going to move it to one of the throw-in positions. So I'm just going to start on this rail here, and I'm going to just throw a spike in here quick to keep that rail tight there. And on mine, I'm going to kind of center that up so that little tab is right under the throw bar, and then I'm going to take a small drill, and I'm going to drill down through that hole in my tab and into the throw bar. I'm going to use a Dremel tool here to drill these holes, but a pin vise would work just as well. I'm sticking it in the hole in the tab, and then I'm turning it on. And I just drilled all the way down through it. Now I'm going to go ahead and take one of these Pico track nails. They're kind of more like a pin, and I am going to cut them shorter. Now it's important to make sure these are shorter than the thickness of your throw bar, so they don't go into the sub road bed there, or I'm sorry, into the road bed. And so I'm just going to make it about the thickness of the throw bar. Something like that there. I'm going to set that aside, and then I'm going to get some CA. Okay, so now I'm going to take some CA, put a little dot out here. And now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take that spike out, and I'm going to take that piece of the Pico track nail that I cut off, and I'm going to move the point over and exposing the hole that we drilled in the throw bar. I'm going to take some of this CA on the piece of the nail that we cut off. I'm going to put it down in the hole that we just drilled. About 3 times. We'll get enough in there. Okay, now I'm going to take a little piece of paper towel, and I'm just going to wipe the glue off the surface of the throw bar. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now, because we didn't move anything, we should be able to slide this back in place. Pick up that cut off piece, and we just stick it down in the hole. And so with that pin in there now, I'm just going to hold that there for just a few minutes and just let that set up. Okay, with that first pin in, I'm going to go ahead and slide this throw bar over into its other throw-in direction. And again, now if you were using a non-DCC friendly turnout, you would want to use the point gauge here to make sure that it had a big enough gap. But since I do have a DCC friendly turnout, I'm actually going to make that gap a little smaller. And now if you had a ground throw, especially if you're using an N scale one, I would have it attached and I would throw the ground throw so I knew how far it was moving the throw bar over. But I'm going to keep mine about like that. And if you have your set of trucks handy, you can make sure you can look down in there and make sure it's not hitting it. I just like a smaller gap there. It looks a little more prototypical. And now we're just going to basically do the exact same thing we did earlier. We're just going to spike that other point over here. And now we're going to drill the hole. Sometimes I like to take these track nails and stick them in the roadbed material there to cut them off so that sharp little pin doesn't go flying. Okay, this is going to wrap it up on the turnout here. You can see I've got the throw bar put in here. And now this is my special situation. Again, I would normally have a throw bar that went under the layout here, but you can see I've got that all connected on there. And we'll just push some cars through here. You can see it runs pretty good. So I hope that encourages you to give hand laying track a try. Again, you don't need the fixtures. They're really nice, but if you have a turnout that needs a special situation, there's really only one way to build that well, and that's just to build it in place. Or maybe you just want to do like I do and just use all wood ties and just build them all to fit the location. Makes for some very nice flowing track when you do things like that. So I hope this helped you out.